Hello, I'm Aaron Nelson, and as a part of this Texas political science class, I am covering the book Tulia, Race, Cocaine, and Corruption in a Small Texas Town by Nate Blakeslee. This was an amazing read, based on a true story that took place back in 1999. Uh, it involved corruption in a small Texas town where a gypsy cop by the name of Tom Coleman, who had bounced from town to town, made a name for herself by taking advantage of a variety of situations at a time when the drug war and the money accompanying it was at an all-time high. He was able to go into the town of Tulia and take advantage of racial misbeliefs or racism, basically. Take advantage of the county's need or the town's need for money, as it was a dying town, as this industry of agriculture was drying up, an aging Anglo population, a immigrant population of Latinos that was moving, taking over the town, changing demographics. And so that resistance to change, that racism, the lack of money, and then the helplessness in the drug war and wanting to do something about it made the blacks of Tulia a easy target for the war on drugs and for Tom Coleman to lead these faulty arrests that ended up bringing in 15% of the black population in Tulia very quickly, placing false drug charges on people, everything from addicts to non-users, and all being falsely accused. And then with over 2 dozen of those people ending up in jail with charges way too long. Um, Eventually, this received national attention through documentaries and then by getting the attention of East Coast lawyers, including being led by a young civil rights attorney by the name of Anita Gupta, as well as other help that she got from people in the town who simply never believed what Coleman, the DA, and the sheriff were all trying to perpetrate as a victory in the war on drugs. And as they brought that national attention, it led to finding holes in Mr. Coleman's methods, his testimony, and even his motivation, which eventually led to pardons for the people who were wrongly put in jail. Now, along the way, Mr. Coleman, for being overzealous and basically destroying these lives, at the time, he was treated like a hero. And so before his fall from grace, he was even recognized as an Officer of the Year. All that's located within the pages of the book. Overall, it is an amazing book, and the author did a great job. He is able to set the tone for the book by painting this picture of Tulia, and he gives background not just on the location, but also on all the characters. He gives us a lot of backstory. He tells about their, whether it be the town or the individuals, about their heyday, their origins, their challenges, and how all of that he combines to create this perfect storm of a town that was struggling as the economy was starting to collapse and money got tight, substance abuse, as well as the burdens of poverty and the racial strain, all led to people being, feeling downtrodden or victimized, and were basically able to be taken advantage of by Mr. Coleman. As he came to town trying to make a name for himself, he would go from town to town, destroying his reputation as a police officer. He would take advantage of people's trust of law enforcement. He would rack up debt. He would abuse his family. And then when the situation would get too complicated, he would move on to the next town. He would also take advantage of the sort of code of silence between officers. And so he would basically escape knowing that bad news about him as an officer would probably not travel to his next role. He was motivated to even be in law enforcement because his father was one of the esteemed Texas Rangers. While he was never able to live up and follow in his father's footsteps, he was able to enter law enforcement. But given he always had sort of a bad streak, he eventually gave in to that, and that showed in each of his roles. Most being magnified by how he was able to bring all these people and destroy these lives by falsely arresting them with bad drug charges. He would even, like I said, not turn in any evidence of wiretapping voice recordings, video. He would be the only witness. He would take drug addicts and frame them as drug dealers. He would dilute the drugs, and he would say his notes were written on his arm, written on his leg when no one was looking. He was taking advantage of what he knew to be the racist beliefs of the people who were in power, which was the aging Anglo population, and that they fit the stereotypes that these people already believed. And he was using that to get these people arrested and sent away and build a reputation for himself. The interesting thing about this book is that although this case took, the charges began back in 1999, and the fallout from this case ran through 2003 and all the way to 2005, many of the issues that the book addresses are still carrying on today. Among those, drug addiction in small Texas towns. One thing to talk about throughout this class has been the migration of people from small towns to the larger cities of Texas, as the businesses such as agriculture have dried up. We see the despair that is left. Texas goes through a lot of things early. This is an indicator with the drug problems going on in this panhandle town. We see that today through the opioid epidemic. We also see the high point of the war on drugs in the United States when the epidemic was crack cocaine, and the group that was targeted were African Americans. By punishing rather than treating drug users, and not just for use, but also framing them as drug dealers, this led to the growth of the prison populations. So a lot of these towns, a lot of these areas, when they could no longer grow a crop, the crop became the harvesting of people, putting them back in jail, building jails to house them in, and that is where the employment for the local citizenry, as well as funding from all over the place, came back into these towns. So the people became the product. We contrast that with today's approach to the war on drugs, where it's not necessarily a war, but the opioid epidemic, because there are some racial undertones. The audience is no longer black, instead it's white, but it's also happening a lot in these poverty-stricken, shrinking towns. We see that there's more of a focus on treatment rather than punishment. And we see that's even hinted at in this book when we have the case of a young man who has struggled with drugs. And rather than the black citizens who are sent away to jail, he's given opportunity over and over again. We also get some undertones of the big sort. And we talk about how people, and race has always been an issue in Texas as well. So we see how the not race is one aspect, but also the conservative culture. And so things such as addiction, rather than being treated as something that you would have to deal with, is treated as a personal failing. And Tulia was always struggling with what we call vices, whether it be drinking, which was a dry county. The location was a dry county, and so drinking had to occur outside the city or through special clubs where you had to be a member. We talk about how interracial relationships, interracial sex, homosexuality were all treated as taboo, and of course, drug usage was also treated as taboo throughout the town, and so we do see those sharp contrasts with ultra conservatism when it comes to behavior in Tulia. Now, the way this book was written, like I said, was amazing, not just through the setup of the location, but the characters, the good and bad characters, were complex people, and they were written in very colorful ways, such as Mr. Gardner, who was a very vocal advocate within the town, who was not afraid to speak truth to power, and how he was always skeptical of the method of these arrests. He was always trying to speak truth to power and stand up for what's right, and so he became a sort of self-taught lawyer, and he was able to use his voice as one of the outspoken white men in town to at least to start to bring attention to the situation. You also hear about Mr. Coleman, who, with his father as a Texas Ranger wearing a white hat, made a decision early on in his life to wear the black hat, and how that's a precursor of his behavior to come. Vanita Gupta, young Indian lady who trained at Yale University, uh, lived around the globe, comes to the South and sees the huge cultural differences and the impact of civil rights, and how she fights, builds a reputation, and gets her first experience by dealing with this huge civil rights case. So we see names that are still prevalent today. Governor George Bush, who later became President Bush. Um, we see our current Senator, John Conrad. Vanita Gupta went on to work, I believe, in the Obama administration. We see other people such as Randy Credico, who I believe has just been brought up in the WikiLeaks connection with Roger Stone in regards to some of the social media tampering with the Russia investigation. So we see a lot of players who have been active on a national scale for a long time, some of them at the beginnings or midpoints, or earlier in their career, rather. So this book does an excellent job at putting personalities and individual families and their stories, and seeing how they play a role in this in these threads that occur throughout the country on a regular basis. There were other scenes and scenarios throughout the book that also sort of divert from the courtroom trials, and that would be things such as hearing what happened in the flats of Tulia, which was the unincorporated area outside of town, and how where the blacks were given some freedom. And so we hear about the raucous cafes and juke joints that people visited on the weekends, and how eventually, as they went away, it brought more attention, negative attention, to the town, and that eventually led to making each targets of the African American population. We get the backstory on Officer Coleman, and how all of his bad behavior eventually led to him being able to take advantage through these faulty arrests. We see the resistance to change through the DA and the sheriff, who are reluctant to even admit that they made a poor decision, and instead felt comfortable having these people gone, even though you didn't see a real change in the drug use of the city of Tulia. One thing that did bog down the book were the level of detail. The testimony was amazing, but by going line by line, some of the back and forth between the lawyers during questioning and the responses of the people on the stand, it tended to drag out situations, especially when you knew that the outcome might not necessarily be in favor. You knew what the outcome was going to be, whether it was going to be a positive verdict or a negative verdict early on, and so I think that could have saved some time within the book. If you were pressed for time, I would stretch out situations, but that would be the only complaint that I have against the book at all. Other than that, like I said, it took a huge cast of characters, gave them very complicated stories, and it gave a very personal touch to major issues that persisted within that time, to that case, how it got more positive attention before the age of social media, and how those same problems still persist in a variety of ways, whether it be through the drug trade, the shrinking of towns, the shifting of the economy, and people heading to the larger cities. And race in America. So once again, it was an amazing book.